Um, we are team one. Our project was analyzing the impact of releasing a COVID-19 vaccine on pharmaceutical stock prices. And in team one, I'm Caitlin Yu, and our other team members are Ellis Che, Sarah Choi, Haeyoung Kim, and Caleb Lee. But Sarah and Caleb cannot be here today because they have other plans and one is not feeling well.
So this is our table of contents. You can see that we're going to start off with the project definition and then go on to background info, data set description, process and methods, graph analysis, observations, references, and questions. Our project was to find the difference in stock prices between pharmaceutical companies that released a vaccine versus companies who did not. To go more into details, we wanted to see where the distinction occurred between these two types of companies and how much that difference was. We used a total of 10 companies, 6 of which released a vaccine in the years 2020 to 2021, and 4 that did not release a vaccine. We purposely used the time frame of the years 2020 to 2021 as this was when the pandemic was at its worst. We hope to use visuals and simple statistics to convey these results.
So our group chose to do a project on this topic because we all have some experience on the impacts of the most recent pandemics. But in the 21st century alone, there have been 5 pandemics similar to this, and these outbreaks have a major impact on the world's economy. So in the light of this, we observe the trends and patterns of the market health by viewing the stock prices of major companies during the COVID-19 pandemic. By viewing the differences between companies who release COVID-19 vaccines and those who do not, shows the importance of vaccination for the market and how prepared each company were for a pandemic. When investors invest into specific stocks allow us to see the investors' sentiment towards COVID-19, foreshadowing similar trends in the pandemics in the future. Understanding this data allows future investors to predict whether investing will be profitable for specific biotech companies. It also helps the companies as they can see how and when making a vaccine pays off. And this will encourage more companies in the future to work on vaccines and help companies optimize their profit through better timing.
Okay. Our first step in the project is, of course, gathering data. And so we chose to use 10 companies, and we gathered this data mostly from the NASDAQ market activity of historical data and occasionally Yahoo Finance. Both of these sites are very credible and are the leading sources for this type of data. In all of these data sets, there was the option of which stock price you wanted to choose, such as high, low, closing, opening, and sometimes the average. We ended up choosing the daily high stock price option. And even with narrowing our time period down to only 2020 and 2021, we still had more than sufficient data to analyze because the stock market is open every business day, and we had the data for all of the past 5 years. The 10 companies we chose came partly from a list of the biggest pharmaceutical companies in 2019, and partly from seeing what companies grew out of the pandemic today. We eventually ended with 4 companies that never released a vaccine, and 6 companies that did release a vaccine in 2020 or 2021. We specifically chose companies that never released a vaccine to avoid the effect on stock prices of announcements of vaccines and other similar things. Our coding process was mainly split into 2 main parts. The first one was manipulating the data, and the second one was graphing the data. So for the manipulation of the data and general cleaning of it, we first used Python to combine all of them into one master data set. And we cleaned the data of symbols such as $signs and commas and also null values. And later, we also used Python to standardize the data. We also used Seaborn and Matplotlib to graph our data, which are included later in this presentation. For the methods we mostly used basic statistical analysis techniques for this project, since we mostly wanted to explain how this event occurred rather than predict another pandemic. Besides finding simple statistics for some subsets of our data, we standardized the stock price later to better analyze it. Standardization allows us to compare different size companies on the same scale, allowing us to focus on the changes in the stock price from the average rather than the actual price itself, which better serves the purpose of looking how the stock prices were changed throughout 2020 and 2021. Additionally, we also use linear regression, giving us a more understandable and more convenient representation of the two types of companies. Our first graph is just a general timeline of COVID and all the stock prices of the companies we chose. It shows a daily high value of each stock price in 2020 and 2021 with no attention to whether or not they produced a vaccine. Visually, we can first see how the introduction of new variants influenced stock prices. The introduction of both the Delta and Omicron variants seemed to significantly raise the stock value of both BioNTech and Moderna. Further, it seemed that the introduction of Pfizer's BioNTech vaccines for ages 12 to 15 had a greater effect on prices compared to vaccines for adults. This drastic increase in stock value can come from a few factors. One being the reintroduction to in-person learning for high schools, or another being the positive investor sentiments toward a vaccine for children. But from here, it becomes harder to see the changes in smaller companies and between the two subsets of companies in general, leading us to our further analyses.
For these two graphs, we took the monthly average of stock prices of companies that released vaccines and the stock price of the companies that didn't release vaccines. Blue represented the vaccine companies and orange representing the ones that didn't release vaccines. Our main goal for these graphs was to see the difference between the two subsets of companies and quantify it in terms of dollars, which at its peak was a $128.06 difference in monthly average stock price. Around this time of the peak, the United States passes the 43 million cases and 700,000 deaths milestone. From the timeline added to the right-hand graph, the release of the Pfizer-BioNTech and Pfizer's vaccine kickstarts the huge increase in vaccine company stock prices. And though we are not focusing on prices after 2021, it's interesting to see how it's only after vaccine company stock prices dropped to pre-peak levels at the start of 2022 that the non-vaccine company stock also started to rise.
Here we graph the standardized values of the monthly averages and use linear regression to represent the two subsets of companies. The intersection between the two lines occurs at around December 21st, 2021, give or take a couple of days, with both types of companies stabilizing back to their average stock price during this time. From the linear regressions, we can see that the companies that released vaccines grew about 8.64% faster than the companies that did not release vaccines, and you can visually see that from the slope of the two lines. It is also interesting to see that before the intersection, companies that eventually released vaccines were generally doing worse than companies that never released a vaccine at all. Perhaps signaling and allows us to infer that the companies that barely felt the impact of the pandemic didn't feel as strong as a need or rush to produce a vaccine as perhaps maybe the companies that were struggling more. And so this leads us to our conclusions. A significant difference between the two subsets of companies appeared in December 2021. From the unstandardized data, we can see that this is the beginning of the large $186 peak and how much higher the vaccine company stock prices were than the non-vaccine companies. And in the standardized graph, this is also when the standardized values of the vaccine company's stock overtake the standardized values of the non-vaccine company's stock. This distinction also corresponds with the release of Pfizer and BioNTech's vaccine release, suggesting that in the future, pharmaceutical companies and biotech companies should announce the release or at least announce their ongoing trials of the vaccine around or after this first vaccine release to maximize their profits. And throughout the project, we noticed a few interesting things. First, when the pandemic announced, we expected that we would see a very big unanimous drop in stock prices. But in fact, there was even a slight increase in many of the companies we looked at. We hypothesized that this might be because of the fact that we are solely looking at pharmaceutical and biotech companies. And so in the future, it could be really interesting to see if this is the same with other industries, or in our case, if this was totally opposite from them. Second, in the future, if there is another pandemic of this size, or even just slightly smaller, it would be really interesting to see how a similar study would compare to our study, and especially if even more companies will invest their time into making vaccines with the hindsight of how well it paid off. Lastly, we had also initially thought to use percent changes, like you see on the market pages, such as up 5% or down 13%. But then, as you can see on the graph on the bottom right, this data was way too volatile to easily analyze or visually understand, leading us to standardization, which still allowed us to take into account differing pre-COVID prices and allowed us to see the relationship between different companies.
So these are our references for our raw data, which is a stock price of individual companies. We got it from Nosky and then finance.yahoo. And then we used the two websites below to get the history of COVID, so we could like match the date with our data. And then for COVID, for coding, the documentations we used are Seaborn, Matplot, and Pandas.
Thank you. Anybody have any questions?
Thank you. Yeah, so any questions or comment?
I
I
had
have a-
one question,
Mhm.
which was that I noticed that a few of your companies, such as like Bayer, for example, Bayer is based in Germany and they primarily operate in Europe. And obviously, how European countries and like the US react differently to the COVID, and especially like the fiasco regarding like when we would release the vaccine in the US. I was wondering, like, would that how big of an effect would that have on like the reliability of the comparisons, considering that responses by different governments obviously had an effect on when these private companies would release their vaccines?
Yeah, that I think that does have like a significant effect. Just because just because of what you said, how different governments handled it. But at the same time, we tried our best to use like a multitude of companies that didn't only operate in the US. And so we also had companies in Asia and other international companies. So I think in the future, what we can do, if we do in a similar study, we can separate it by country instead and find those countries' companies to compare with. Yeah, so that was a really good question you brought up.
Mhm. Yeah, so you just focus on the pharmaceutical companies, who are generating the vaccine, or who are not generating, right?
Mhm.
So is there any kind of the general trend of the stock market? Sorry, in any kind of comparison with some general movement of the stock market and these pharmaceutical companies?
Yeah, so we were initially like our idea for this project was initially like general companies. And from like what we explored there, the pharmaceutical companies had a lot higher peaks than other companies such as like retail, restaurant, and so on. Especially when the pandemic was announced, such as I think it was either March or May. In our graph that's on the screen right now, you can see that there's barely even a dip. In fact, there's even a slight increase. But then in a lot of other industries, their stock prices dropped down a lot more because a lot of them were reliant on in-person business.
Yeah, so that is a kind of expected one, but I just want to see how much. So you mean there are some big gap, the totally different movement, right?
Yes.
I see. Can you go to the conclusion section?
Mhm.
Okay. So yeah, in just plain sentence, what is your conclusion?
Our conclusion is that a significant difference between companies that released the vaccine and those who didn't appeared in December of 2021. And following this is a significant pull away in stock prices of companies that released vaccines, suggesting that for other companies in the future, they should use this data to kind of like influence their decisions in vaccine investing, I guess.
Okay. All right, good. So
right,
any
thank you.
others? No?
Oh, I have a
Oh.
question.
Sure.
Do you guys feel like there could have been, I guess, kind of like a causation correlation relationship? Because I mean, I don't really know that much about biotech companies, like how big some of them are, But do you
Mhm.
feel like some of the bigger biotech companies would have been more easily able to like develop a vaccine since they did it really quickly in like a year or so? And like the smaller
Uh,
biotech companies?
It's interesting to see though, if you look at like the general timeline, I think a couple slides up, if you can do that. You can see that Johnson & Johnson was actually leading the pharmaceutical / biotech industry in 2019. But then it wasn't them that first released their vaccine. It was actually the smaller companies that were more up and coming, such as BioNTech, Moderna, and even Pfizer that released them first and thus got the most benefit.
So there can be some totally different, maybe factors.
Mhm.
Because yeah, their way to generate the vaccines in scientifically is totally different approaches. But
Yeah.
some approaches more successful.
Mhm.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you.